You think you can just walk around like you own the place?" The voice was sharp, dripping with disdain as Officer James Carter's hand shot out, grabbing Tiffany Brown's wrist with unnecessary force. Tiffany froze for a second, her heart pounding in her chest as she felt the cold metal of the handcuffs tighten around her wrists. The bright afternoon sun bathed the city streets in warm light, but the moment felt colder than she had ever imagined. The bustling noises of cars, pedestrians, and distant chatter became distant echoes, as if the world was fading out and the only thing that mattered was the officer standing before her. Tiffany had been stopped for a routine traffic violation, at least, that's what she thought when she pulled over. A slight misstep in her driving, she thought, and maybe a warning. But the situation quickly escalated. The officer had already made his mind up about her before she even opened her mouth. She was a woman of color. She was a target. As she stood there, cuffed in the middle of the busy street, she could feel the eyes of passers-by on her, some curious, some indifferent, others perhaps secretly judging her. It wasn't just the heat of the day that made her feel sweat trickling down her back, it was the realization that her life, her identity, had been reduced to something ugly and unfair. "I'm just doing my job," she thought, trying to steady herself. She had been here before, faced similar situations growing up, but never like this, not with the handcuffs clicking into place in the middle of the day, under the harsh light of a system that often didn't seem to care. Officer Carter's voice broke through her thoughts. "I've seen your kind before," he muttered, his words like a slap to her face. "You people always think you can get away with things. Not today." Tiffany's breath hitched, but she didn't let him see her flinch. She knew what this was. This wasn't about the traffic stop. This wasn't about her driving. This was about him seeing her as less than human. Tiffany had worked too hard for too long to let this moment define her. She wasn't just another black woman on the side of the road. She wasn't just another victim of a system that had long turned a blind eye to injustice. She was Tiffany Brown, an attorney at a prestigious firm, a woman who fought for justice every day. But today, she wasn't fighting in the courtroom. She wasn't fighting in her office. She was fighting for her dignity on the side of a city street. "You've got it all wrong," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong. I am not the criminal here." Officer Carter didn't listen. His grip tightened on her arm, pulling her toward his patrol car. The feeling of helplessness crept in, but Tiffany refused to let it consume her. She had been fighting her entire life for equality, for fairness, for the simple truth that she, too, deserved respect. And here she was, standing in broad daylight, being reduced to something she wasn't. He didn't know who he was dealing with. He didn't know the power she held, not just as an attorney, but as a woman who would not let this moment slide without action. She could feel her phone in her pocket, and in that instant, she knew she had to make a call. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed her colleague. "Get ready for the next step. I'm about to make this right," she whispered, barely audible but with a sense of determination that filled her entire being. "You have no idea who I am," Tiffany added, louder this time, as she felt the rush of adrenaline fill her veins. The officer's face twitched, but he didn't respond. She wasn't sure if he was even listening anymore. The only thing she could hear was the thudding of her heart as she stood there, surrounded by the judgment of a system she knew all too well. Tiffany knew that in moments like this, silence could be as powerful as action. She wasn't going to scream. She wasn't going to break down. She was going to take her power back, one step at a time. The officer may have thought he had the upper hand, but he didn't know the whole story. He didn't know who she was, or who her colleagues were. The moment felt like it was suspended in time. And then, just like that, her phone buzzed. Tiffany raised her head, her eyes locking onto the officer. "You'll regret this," she said softly. The words weren't a threat. They were a promise. Her heart pounded louder in her chest now. She wasn't just a woman caught in a traffic stop anymore. She was someone who had the power to turn the tables, someone who could make the world listen. And soon, the world would know exactly who she was. The minutes felt like hours as Tiffany stood there, her hand still cuffed behind her back, the bright sun beaming down on the pavement. The sound of the city seemed muffled, drowned out by the beating of her heart. Officer James Carter paced back and forth, clearly agitated, his eyes flicking nervously towards his squad car. Tiffany's mind raced, but she kept her composure. She had dealt with much worse than this, much more dangerous situations. But this? This was personal. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong. It was a reminder of something deeper, something that she had fought her whole life to overcome. The humiliation she felt now wasn't just about being wrongfully accused, it was about the system that had always treated people like her as second-class citizens. And this officer, this man who thought he had the right to treat her this way, was the perfect example of that system. She had to stay calm, but inside, the storm was brewing. Every minute that ticked by felt like it was pushing her to do something that would turn the tables. The sound of footsteps approached, but this time, they weren't just from any passerby or bystander. Tiffany recognized them. Her colleague, Mark, had arrived. Mark had been with her through many high-stakes cases, and his presence now felt like a lifeline. He was no stranger to the game. He knew how to play it, how to get results. Mark walked up to Officer Carter, his expression calm but serious. Tiffany's breath caught in her chest. She had known that this moment would come. She had known that someone would step in, but she didn't expect it to happen so soon. Officer Carter looked Mark up and down, sizing him up, but there was no mistaking the nervous energy in his movements. Mark was a former prosecutor, well known for handling tough cases, and he wasn't the type of person anyone could brush aside easily. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Mark's voice was calm, yet it carried an unmistakable authority that made even Officer Carter hesitate. The officer shifted his weight, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation, but the doubt was creeping in. He wasn't used to people questioning his authority. "I'm just doing my job," he said, but his words lacked conviction. Mark didn't even flinch. "Your job," he repeated, his voice still calm but now edged with a quiet intensity. "What exactly are you doing to this woman?" Tiffany could feel the tension between the two men, and for the first time since she was stopped, she felt a small flicker of hope. This was the moment. This was the moment when things started to change. Officer Carter hesitated again, but Tiffany knew he was beginning to crack. He couldn't keep up the facade of authority for much longer. She could see the shift in his eyes, he was realizing that this wasn't just about a simple traffic stop. Tiffany hadn't spoken much, but she didn't need to. Everything she had worked for, everything she had achieved, was now on full display in the most public way possible. The officer had made a mistake. And he was about to find out just how big that mistake was. Tiffany could see Mark's eyes flicker toward her phone, still clutched tightly in her hand. It had been buzzing continuously in her pocket, the calls, the messages, they all had one thing in common. Tiffany was no ordinary woman. She was no one to be dismissed. She was Tiffany Brown, an attorney, and she had a reputation for fighting back. The officer's grip on her arm loosened slightly as he glanced nervously at Mark, who remained poised, unwavering. Tiffany's heart pounded faster now, but her body remained still. She had to play her part, she had to stay composed. She knew what was coming. Officer Carter was starting to realize that he had underestimated her. He had underestimated the consequences of his actions. Tiffany wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't going to let him think that he could get away with what he had done. Not now. Not ever. Finally, Officer Carter stepped back, the tension still hanging thick in the air. "I'll have to call this in," he muttered, his voice sounding less certain than before. Tiffany didn't respond, but she could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He knew he was losing control. The city would pay for this. Tiffany's phone buzzed again. It was the message she had been waiting for. The city had agreed to settle the case for $2.1 million. She wasn't surprised. What surprised her was the message that followed it. This is far from over. It wasn't just the money that mattered. It was the message. The message that they had no idea who they were dealing with. And she was going to make sure the world knew. As Mark stepped aside, the officer's gaze met Tiffany's once again. This time, there was no arrogance in his eyes. Just fear. Fear of the consequences. Fear of what would happen when the truth came to light. Tiffany didn't smile. She didn't have to. She knew that justice was on its way. And she was ready for it. The air around Tiffany felt thicker now, almost suffocating. Officer Carter had stepped back, his shoulders stiff, and the world around her seemed to pause for a moment. Tiffany, still with her hands cuffed, stood tall and unwavering as Mark exchanged words with the officer. Her mind, however, was racing. Every second felt like a step closer to the moment of reckoning. She had never imagined that her fight for justice would take this turn, not here, not today. Yet, the truth was clear now, this wasn't just about a wrongful traffic stop. This was about a system that needed to be held accountable. The moment she'd felt her phone buzz in her pocket had been the signal that things were about to change. Tiffany had worked tirelessly for years to reach this point, and now she was ready to make her stand. It wasn't just her reputation on the line, it was the reputation of everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, anyone who had faced discrimination without a voice. Tiffany knew that the outcome of this day would have ripple effects far beyond this street, beyond this moment. Officer Carter may have thought he had the upper hand when he first pulled her over. He had seen her, just another black woman on the road, someone he could control, someone he could dismiss. But what he didn't realize was that Tiffany wasn't just another face. She was a force, and the world was about to see it. As Mark and Officer Carter spoke in low voices, Tiffany allowed herself a small moment of clarity. She had been here before. She had faced injustices, some big, some small, but this was different. This wasn't just about one officer's ignorance. This was about a system that had allowed this to happen for far too long. Tiffany knew it wasn't just about taking down Officer Carter, although she knew that would be a part of it. This was about making sure that every person who had ever been treated like she had today would know they were not alone. "This isn't over," Mark said, his voice cutting through her thoughts. Tiffany turned to face him, her expression one of quiet resolve. "It's just beginning," she replied, her words firm. Mark nodded, as if he understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Tiffany could see it in his eyes. He had been with her through countless battles, but this one felt different. "We've got them now," he said, his voice steady, almost reassuring. "It's only a matter of time before the truth comes out." Tiffany didn't need reassurance. She knew what had to be done. The fight was no longer just about this traffic stop. It was about the fight for equality, for fairness, for justice in a world that had long forgotten the value of both. Officer Carter stood silently, his hands twitching slightly as he avoided Tiffany's gaze. He knew the moment he made the wrong call, he'd triggered something he wouldn't be able to undo. The officer glanced toward his squad car, his face now pale, the adrenaline starting to drain from his system. The realization that his actions were being scrutinized, that someone would hold him accountable, was something he had never expected. Tiffany stood her ground. "Call whoever you need to call," she said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet power. "But you're going to be answering for this." The officer's eyes flickered, unsure of what to say. He could feel the weight of Tiffany's words, but it was already too late. Tiffany had made her decision. She wasn't going to let this go. Not now, not ever. Her phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't just a text message. It was a call. Tiffany reached for it, her hand steady as she answered. Mark shot her a quick glance, but Tiffany didn't break eye contact with Officer Carter. "Hello," she said, her voice steady, as if she were speaking to someone she had known for years. "Tiffany," came the voice on the other end, urgent but calm. "The city has agreed to the settlement, $2.1 million. But we're not stopping there. This goes public. You'll have the press, the media, the whole city watching." Tiffany's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this, but hearing the confirmation felt like a victory in itself. "Thank you," she replied, her tone unwavering. Make sure the world knows what happened here. Make sure they know this isn't just about money. This is about justice. This is about righting a wrong that has been allowed to fester for too long. The person on the other end of the line paused. You're not backing down, are you? Tiffany smiled slightly, a rare flash of warmth in her otherwise composed expression. Not this time, she said. This isn't just about me. This is about everyone who has been silenced. Everyone who has been pushed aside. We're making sure their voices are heard. As she ended the call, Tiffany looked back at Officer Carter. The officer now stood a few feet away, his back to her, but she could feel the shift in the air. He knew this was just the beginning. Tiffany wasn't going to let this go, and neither would anyone else who had ever faced injustice. The city, the courts, the system, none of it would escape unscathed. Tiffany had made her mark, and now she was going to make sure it was felt by everyone who had ever been complicit in turning a blind eye. Justice was coming. And it was going to make waves. The days following the incident felt like a blur, but Tiffany's resolve never wavered. She could feel the eyes of the city on her, and despite the media attention and the spotlight now shining on her case, there was a strange calmness within her. She had fought for justice before, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't just her fight. This was the moment when everything changed. Tiffany knew that Officer Carter wasn't the only one who needed to be held accountable. This was about the system that allowed this to happen over and over again, with no consequences. And she was going to make sure it paid the price. Every day, she received calls from reporters, colleagues, and even strangers who wanted to know her side of the story. They wanted her to be the voice of change. And Tiffany knew that, for once, she could be. One evening, as Tiffany sat in her apartment, reviewing documents and case files, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Mark. The press conference is tomorrow. We need to be ready. Tiffany sat back in her chair and took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been preparing for. She had worked tirelessly for years, but it was now that the world would finally hear her. She wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She was a symbol of resistance, a voice for the voiceless. As she arrived at the press conference the next day, Tiffany was met by a sea of reporters, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in her direction. But she wasn't nervous. She had been in this position before, but this time, it felt different. This time, it wasn't just about a courtroom. This time, it was about the world seeing the truth for what it was. She stepped up to the podium, the bright lights blinding her for a moment before she adjusted. Thank you all for being here, she began, her voice steady and clear. I stand before you not just as an attorney, but as a woman who has faced the kind of injustice that far too many of us experience every day. The events that took place on that street were not just an isolated incident. They are a symptom of a larger issue, one that has been allowed to persist for far too long. Tiffany paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. She could feel the weight of the room's attention on her, but she wasn't afraid. She had already made her peace with what was to come. We are not here just to seek financial compensation, she continued, we are here to demand change. We are here to hold people accountable, not just for their actions, but for the systems that have enabled them. Officer Carter's actions were wrong. But they are not an anomaly. They are part of a much larger problem. And it is time for that problem to be fixed. The room was silent for a moment, the reporters hanging on her every word. Tiffany felt the weight of their gaze, but she stood firm, knowing that this was her moment to make a difference. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every person who had ever been unjustly treated, every person who had been silenced by a system that didn't care. This is not just about me, she said, her voice rising with conviction. This is about the countless people who have been mistreated by those who are supposed to protect us. This is about justice for every black man, woman, and child who has been wronged simply because of the color of their skin. And I will not rest until we see real change. As Tiffany finished her speech, she felt a surge of emotion rise within her. It wasn't the tears of frustration or anger, but the tears of someone who had finally found their voice. She had been quiet for so long, but now, the world was listening. The press conference was just the beginning. Tiffany knew that there would be more battles to fight, more obstacles to overcome. But this time, she wasn't alone. The city had heard her. And she would make sure they remembered her. Officer Carter's name would be a footnote in this story. The real story was about the change Tiffany was going to make, the change that the world needed. Tiffany smiled to herself as she left the podium, knowing that this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The aftermath of the press conference left Tiffany with an unexpected feeling of peace. She had spoken her truth, and now, the world was watching. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for sure: the world was not the same as it had been just a few days ago. Tiffany sat quietly in her office, surrounded by the familiar hum of the city outside, but inside, everything felt different. The calls kept coming, news outlets, legal teams, activists, but Tiffany knew the battle wasn't over. This wasn't about publicity. This wasn't about fame. This was about making sure the truth remained in the spotlight. The truth that had been hidden for far too long. Officer Carter had been the face of her fight, but the system that allowed his actions to go unchecked was the real enemy. Tiffany thought back to that day on the street, when her hands had been cuffed and her dignity questioned. She could still feel the sting of those moments, but now, there was a fire inside her that she hadn't felt before. This was more than just personal. It was about justice for every person who had been silenced. She had seen what had happened when people who were meant to serve and protect became part of the problem. It had to change. As she sat at her desk, Tiffany's mind wandered to the next steps. She had already spoken to her legal team, and they were working relentlessly to ensure that the investigation into Officer Carter was thorough. But Tiffany knew that wasn't enough. There had to be consequences not just for him, but for the system that had protected him for so long. She had learned over the years that change didn't happen overnight. It took time. But it also took relentless pressure. Tiffany wasn't going to stop. She had already seen the power of her voice. Now, it was time to use it again. Later that afternoon, she received another call. It was from the mayor's office. Tiffany had been expecting this. She had made waves, and now, the city had to decide how to respond. The mayor, a man known for his political savvy, was on the other end of the line, his voice measured but with an underlying urgency. "Tiffany," he began, "I've been following everything closely. I want to assure you that we are taking your case seriously." Tiffany didn't flinch. She had heard these kinds of statements before. Politicians were always quick to assure people that they were on the side of justice, but Tiffany wasn't interested in words. She was interested in action. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, her voice steady. "But words are not enough. This system needs to change. The city cannot keep turning a blind eye to this kind of behavior. Officer Carter is just the beginning. There are others, and they need to be held accountable, too." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Tiffany could sense that the mayor wasn't used to being spoken to in this way. But she wasn't backing down. "We will do what we can," the mayor said finally. "But it will take time. You know how these things work." Tiffany's eyes narrowed as she leaned back in her chair. "I'm not asking for a favor," she said firmly. "I'm demanding justice. And I'm not going away until I get it." The mayor's tone shifted slightly, more guarded now. "We'll have to work within the system, Tiffany. It's not as simple as you might think." "I know exactly how complicated it is," she replied. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for. The people of this city deserve better." After the call ended, Tiffany sat quietly for a moment. She knew this fight wasn't going to be easy. She knew there would be resistance, obstacles, and setbacks. But none of that mattered. She wasn't in this for the short term. She was in it for the long haul. Tiffany had seen too much in her life to let things slide. She had seen firsthand how easy it was for people to turn their heads when it was convenient. But now, the spotlight was on her, and she wasn't going to let it fade. The next day, the media frenzy continued. Tiffany's name was everywhere, on the front pages of newspapers, trending on social media, and the subject of countless news segments. But for Tiffany, the noise didn't matter. What mattered was the work that still lay ahead. She spent her days preparing for the next stage of her campaign, working with activists and legal experts to create a movement that could bring about real change. She knew it wouldn't happen overnight, but Tiffany was used to long battles. She had fought before, and she would fight again. The road to justice was never easy, but Tiffany had always believed that it was worth the struggle. As she looked out the window of her office, the city bustling below, Tiffany knew that this was just the beginning. Officer Carter had become a symbol, but the real change would come when the system itself was forced to reckon with its failures. Tiffany wasn't afraid to keep pushing. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would keep fighting. For what was right. This wasn't just about her. This was about every single person who had been hurt by an unjust system. And Tiffany was ready to make sure that they would never be silenced again. The following weeks felt like a whirlwind, but Tiffany remained focused. The city was now fully awake to the changes that were coming, and the pressure was mounting. Tiffany could feel it in every conversation, every glance, every word. The case against Officer Carter was moving forward, but it was only the first domino in what was becoming a far larger movement. Tiffany's phone buzzed constantly with updates, calls from reporters, and messages of support from activists and ordinary citizens. Her victory was only one small part of the greater goal. She wasn't about to let it stop there. One morning, as Tiffany sat at her desk preparing for the next steps, she received a call from her legal team. They had been working tirelessly to gather evidence, connect with witnesses, and build a case that could stand up to the pressure that would inevitably come. Tiffany, the voice on the other end of the line, said, "We've got some developments. We're making progress." Tiffany sat up straighter, her attention sharp. "What's the latest?" she asked, her voice steady, not betraying the excitement she felt inside. "We've got new footage. It's clearer than ever that Officer Carter's actions were not only illegal but part of a pattern. He's been involved in multiple incidents like this, and we have proof," the lawyer continued. Tiffany's heart skipped a beat. This was what she had been waiting for. "That's exactly what we need," she said, her voice calm but with a note of satisfaction. "Let's keep pushing. We need to make sure this time, the system doesn't turn a blind eye." After the call ended, Tiffany took a deep breath. She knew the fight was far from over. She had spent years in courtrooms, working her way up, gaining experience, but this was different. This wasn't just about law. This was about changing the culture, breaking the system that allowed men like Officer Carter to get away with abuse. Tiffany knew she couldn't do it alone. She had built a network of people who understood that the work wasn't just about one case. It was about creating a future where justice wasn't a luxury, but a right for all. Over the next few days, the media frenzy intensified. The story had taken on a life of its own. Protests erupted, voices rising in the streets demanding accountability. Tiffany watched from her office window as people took to the streets, their chants echoing in the air. It was empowering, knowing that she was not just leading this charge, but that so many others were standing alongside her. The people who had been silenced for so long were finally speaking up. Tiffany spent her days meeting with community leaders, legal experts, and activists. They all had one thing in common, the desire to see real change. Tiffany wasn't just a symbol anymore. She was a leader in a movement that was quickly gaining momentum. But despite all the attention, Tiffany knew that the real battle was in the courtroom. It was easy to get caught up in the noise, to be swept away by the media frenzy. But Tiffany had always been focused. She had a clear goal, not only to bring Officer Carter to justice but to ensure that no one else would have to face what she had faced. The days turned into weeks, and as the investigation into Officer Carter expanded, more and more incidents began to surface. Tiffany's legal team had gathered a mountain of evidence that tied Carter to a long history of misconduct. As Tiffany prepared for the next stage of the trial, she felt the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly, every person who had been discriminated against because of the color of their skin. The trial began with the usual formalities. Officer Carter, now the focus of a national story, sat in the defendant's seat, his face a mask of defiance. But Tiffany wasn't intimidated. She knew what she had to do. As the trial unfolded, the evidence piled up. Tiffany's team presented the footage, the testimony from witnesses, and the records that showed Carter's long history of abuse. The defense tried to discredit the evidence, but it was too late. The truth had already been exposed. Tiffany sat in the front row, watching the trial unfold with calm precision. Her mind was focused, her strategy clear. She had prepared for this moment for years, and now it was time to see it through. The weight of the case was heavy, but Tiffany had always carried weight before. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courtroom palpable. Tiffany's heart beat steadily, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about Officer Carter. This was about changing the system. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned. Tiffany's pulse quickened as the foreman stood to read the verdict. The room was silent. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer James Carter, guilty on all charges." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Tiffany felt a rush of emotion flood through her. It wasn't over yet, but this was a victory, a step toward the justice that had been denied for so long. As the courtroom began to empty, Tiffany stood up, her legs steady beneath her. She had done it. Officer Carter had been held accountable, but Tiffany knew this was just the beginning. There was so much more work to do. The real fight, the one that would change the system, was still ahead. But for now, Tiffany allowed herself a brief moment to reflect. She had made it through the fire, and now, she was ready for whatever came next. The weeks following the verdict felt like a blur, but Tiffany's purpose remained unwavering. The trial had ended, and Officer Carter had been convicted, but Tiffany knew that this was just one battle won in a war that was far from over. The weight of the moment had not settled into her bones, and as much as she wanted to savor the victory, she understood the broader implications. This was not the end. This was only the beginning. Tiffany sat in her office, her gaze fixed on the city below. The skyline, bathed in the light of a setting sun, seemed peaceful, almost serene. But the city wasn't as calm as it appeared. There was still work to be done. There were still people in positions of power who thought they were untouchable, and Tiffany was determined to change that. The phone rang, snapping Tiffany out of her thoughts. It was Mark. "Tiffany," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of excitement. "The mayor's office wants to meet with you. They're ready to discuss the next steps." Tiffany's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this. The mayor's office had been quiet in the weeks after the verdict, but now, they were ready to talk. "Set it up," she said, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "We've waited long enough." Tiffany hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The city had taken its first steps toward accountability, but Tiffany knew that real change wouldn't happen unless those in power were ready to make uncomfortable decisions. The meeting with the mayor was scheduled for the following week, and Tiffany had prepared herself for the challenge. She wasn't going to settle for half measures or empty promises. The city had to do more than just acknowledge the problem, it had to act. The day of the meeting arrived, and Tiffany walked into the mayor's office with a sense of resolve. She wasn't intimidated by the glossy walls or the polished furniture. She had seen it all before. What mattered now was the conversation that was about to unfold. The mayor, a tall man in his 50s with sharp features and a well-groomed appearance, stood as Tiffany entered the room. "Ms. Brown," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for meeting with me today." Tiffany shook his hand firmly, her grip unyielding. "It's time we talk about what comes next," she said. The mayor motioned for her to sit, and they both took their places at the conference table. Tiffany could see the tension in the mayor's eyes. He had always been a political animal, but now he was faced with a decision that could shape his legacy. "I'm sure you're aware that we've received a lot of pressure since the verdict," the mayor said, his voice measured. And I want to be clear, we are committed to making sure this doesn't happen again. But real change takes time. Tiffany leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. Change has already taken too long, she said, her voice steady but powerful. The time for talking is over. We need action, and we need it now. The people of this city are demanding it. The mayor sighed, running a hand through his hair. I understand that, Tiffany. But we have to work within the system. We can't just make sweeping changes overnight. Tiffany didn't flinch. I'm not asking for overnight change. I'm asking for real, sustainable reform. I'm asking for the city to stop protecting officers like Carter, to start holding all officers accountable, not just the ones who get caught. The mayor looked down for a moment, clearly grappling with the weight of Tiffany's words. What do you want from us? He asked quietly. Tiffany's gaze softened, but her resolve remained firm. I want an independent review of the police department. I want oversight. I want transparency. And I want a clear plan to address the systemic issues that allowed this to happen in the first place. I'm not here to make demands for myself. I'm here for every person who has ever been silenced by a system that's supposed to protect them. The mayor nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. We can begin with an independent review, he said finally. But the rest will take time. We'll need to work with the police union, with community leaders, and with the public. This will require a lot of cooperation. Tiffany's eyes remained locked on his. Cooperation is fine. But make no mistake, this will not be a negotiation. The people have spoken, and they will not be ignored. The mayor sat back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. I can promise you, Tiffany, we will move forward with this. But you have to understand, this is going to be a long process. There will be pushback. Tiffany nodded. I'm prepared for that. I've been fighting my entire life for justice. I'm not going to stop now. The mayor seemed to consider this for a moment before nodding in agreement. All right, he said, finally. We'll start the process. We'll make it official. But you need to be patient with us. Tiffany stood, her eyes never leaving his. I'll be patient, she said. But I'll be watching. And I'll be pushing for change every single day. As she walked out of the mayor's office, Tiffany felt a sense of clarity. This was just another step in the long road ahead. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long time, Tiffany felt like real change was within reach. The system that had allowed so many to suffer was beginning to crack. And Tiffany Brown was right there, pushing it forward. She wasn't going anywhere. Not until the job was done. Days turned into weeks, and Tiffany felt the weight of the progress slowly building. The mayor had kept his word, but Tiffany knew that the work was far from complete. The independent review of the police department had started, but the true test would come when the findings were made public. The pressure on the city was immense, and Tiffany could sense it in every conversation she had, in every meeting she attended. People were watching. The city was watching. The entire nation was watching. Tiffany sat in her office, going over case files, responding to messages, and preparing for what was to come. Her phone buzzed, another call. This time, it was from a reporter she had spoken to before, asking for an update on the situation. Tiffany had become a regular subject of media coverage. People were fascinated by her strength, her resolve, and her willingness to fight against the system. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about every person who had ever been wronged. Tiffany, the public is waiting for your next move, the reporter said, a sense of urgency in his voice. What's the next step in your fight for justice? Tiffany paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had thought long and hard about this. She wasn't one to rush into decisions. Every move had to be calculated. The next step is making sure that this process doesn't stall. The police department has been given a chance to review itself, but we need independent oversight. This isn't something that can be handled behind closed doors. Transparency is key, and we're not backing down until we see it through." The reporter's voice softened, as if he were absorbing her words. "Do you think the mayor will follow through on his promises?" Tiffany didn't hesitate. "I believe he will. But it's not just about the mayor. It's about everyone in the system who has been complicit in letting this kind of behavior go unpunished. The real work will come when we hold everyone accountable." The reporter paused. "And what about Officer Carter? What do you expect to happen to him?" Tiffany's gaze shifted to the window, her eyes scanning the city below. "Officer Carter will face the consequences of his actions. But it's bigger than him. This is about changing the system so that no officer, no matter their rank or position, can escape accountability for misconduct." As the conversation ended, Tiffany felt the familiar stir of determination within her. She wasn't finished yet. There was still much to be done. But this fight wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been wronged by the system, to every person who had been forced to remain silent in the face of injustice. Tiffany's team continued to work around the clock, gathering information, preparing legal strategies, and communicating with the public. Tiffany had become a leader in this movement, but she never lost sight of the bigger picture. Her victory wasn't just about one police officer being held accountable. It was about changing the way the entire system operated. She spent more time now meeting with activists and community leaders, people who had been working on this issue long before her case became headline news. They shared their stories, their frustrations, their hopes for change. Tiffany listened, offering support, guidance, and her expertise where it was needed. Together, they formed a coalition that was unstoppable. The work wasn't always easy, but Tiffany knew that they were on the right path. One evening, as Tiffany prepared to leave the office, her phone buzzed again. It was Mark. "Tiffany, I think we're ready," he said, his voice calm but filled with anticipation. "The findings from the review are in." Tiffany's heart raced. She had been waiting for this moment. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice steady but betraying a hint of urgency. Mark took a breath. "It's worse than we thought. The department has systemic issues, corruption, cover-ups, and a culture that allows officers like Carter to abuse their power." Tiffany's stomach tightened. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed was another thing entirely. "What now?" she asked. Mark's response was clear. "Now, we go public. The world needs to know." Tiffany nodded, already preparing herself for the storm that was about to come. The moment of truth was here. The city had been given a chance to change, and now, the people were about to demand it. Tiffany had been fighting for this moment her entire life. She was ready for whatever came next. The next day, Tiffany stood before a crowd of reporters, her expression calm but fierce. She knew the weight of what was about to happen. The findings from the review were shocking. The police department, which was supposed to protect and serve, had allowed corruption and abuse to flourish unchecked. This wasn't just a few bad apples, it was a culture, a system built on secrecy and silence. As Tiffany spoke, she made it clear that the city could no longer turn a blind eye to the injustices that had been allowed to persist for far too long. The time for change had come. "We can no longer accept a system that turns a blind eye to the abuses of power," she said, her voice steady but powerful. "We must hold those in power accountable, not just for their actions, but for the systems they uphold. This is not just about one officer, this is about a culture of silence, and it ends now." The media erupted, their cameras flashing as they captured the weight of her words. Tiffany knew this was just the beginning, but as she stood there, her voice ringing out in the public square, she felt a deep sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but Tiffany was no longer just a voice. She was a force for change, and nothing would stop her now. The weeks following the public release of the review findings were marked by intense scrutiny and mounting pressure. Tiffany had known the storm would come, but she never anticipated the sheer force with which it hit. The media, the public, and even internal forces within the police department began to mobilize in ways that Tiffany had both expected and feared. The findings were damning. The department was riddled with corruption, nepotism, and a dangerous culture of silence. But Tiffany wasn't afraid. She had known the depth of the rot before it was officially exposed. Now, the challenge was to make sure the momentum didn't slow, that the voices calling for change didn't fade into the background. Tiffany had become the face of this movement, but as much as she appreciated the recognition, she knew that her own voice wasn't enough. She was just one person in a much larger system. The real power lay in the collective will of those who had suffered, those who had been unjustly treated, and those who had been silenced for too long. She had to keep pushing. In the midst of all the noise, Tiffany took time to visit the communities that had supported her from the start. She wanted to hear their stories, to understand the depth of their pain, and to ensure that their voices were amplified. It wasn't just about reforming the police force, it was about rebuilding trust in the system, a system that had betrayed so many. Tiffany arrived in one of the neighborhoods that had been most vocal in their support for her cause. The streets were filled with people, some standing together in small groups, others going about their daily routines. But there was a noticeable tension in the air, a kind of unspoken understanding that things were changing. Tiffany was greeted warmly by the community leaders, who had been fighting for justice long before her own case had brought attention to the issue. They were wary of the political machine, but they were ready to fight alongside Tiffany. "You've got our backs," one of them said, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. "Now we need to know you won't stop. We need to know this isn't just talk." Tiffany met her gaze, understanding the weight of the words. "This isn't just talk," she said firmly. "This is about all of us. We're not backing down until we see real change." The leaders nodded, and the conversation shifted to what needed to be done next. It was clear that the community wanted tangible actions, not empty promises. Tiffany knew that the fight wasn't just going to be in the courtroom or with the city's political leaders. It was going to be in the streets, in the neighborhoods, in the hearts and minds of those who had been left behind. Over the next few days, Tiffany worked closely with community leaders to organize peaceful protests, town hall meetings, and public discussions on police reform. She wasn't just trying to change laws, she was trying to change minds, to show people that they had the power to stand up and demand what was rightfully theirs, justice. At the same time, the pressure from city officials was mounting. Tiffany's phone rang non-stop, mostly from officials who wanted to discuss the way forward. The mayor, the city council, and various political players all tried to assure Tiffany that things were moving in the right direction, but Tiffany knew better than to believe words alone. She needed action. One evening, as Tiffany sat at her desk, sifting through documents related to the upcoming reforms, she received an unexpected call. It was from the mayor's office. She hadn't spoken to him since their last meeting, and she could tell from his tone that something had changed. "Tiffany," the mayor said, his voice tight, "I want to meet with you again. We need to talk about the next phase of the reforms." Tiffany's mind immediately went into high gear. "What kind of reforms are you talking about?" she asked, her voice steady, but her eyes narrowing. "The kind that involves real change," the mayor replied. "I know you've been pushing for transparency, and we've heard you. I think it's time we take the next step." Tiffany didn't hesitate. "Set it up. I'll be there." The meeting was scheduled for the following day. Tiffany knew this would be a crucial conversation, one that could determine whether the momentum for real change would continue or stall. She wasn't going to settle for anything less than true reform. The next day, Tiffany arrived at the mayor's office, her mind sharp and focused. The mayor was waiting for her, his demeanor more serious than it had been in their previous meeting. He seemed more prepared now, as if the pressure had finally gotten to him. "Tiffany," the mayor began, "I think we're ready to move forward with a proposal. We've got a plan for oversight, and we're going to put in place new training for the officers. It won't happen overnight, but we're committed to the change you've been fighting for." Tiffany listened, her expression unreadable. She had heard these words before. It wasn't enough. "I'm glad to hear it," Tiffany said, her voice calm, "but you know as well as I do that training and oversight aren't going to be enough. This is about accountability. This is about making sure that those who abuse their power face the consequences. We can't just patch the system. We need to rebuild it from the ground up. The mayor seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're right. But this will be a process, Tiffany. It's going to take time. Tiffany didn't flinch. Time is something we don't have, she said. You've already had enough time to let this go on for too long. Now, it's time for real action. The mayor took a deep breath, clearly weighing his options. Tiffany had pushed him to the edge, and now it was time for him to make a choice. We'll do it your way, he said quietly. But we'll need your help. We need to work together on this. Tiffany nodded, knowing that this was a turning point. I'll do my part, she said. But I won't stop until we've made the changes that are long overdue. As she left the mayor's office, Tiffany felt the weight of the moment sink in. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for. The fight was far from over, but with each step, they were getting closer to the justice they deserved. Tiffany was ready. She had already come this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. The city would change. It had to. And Tiffany was going to make sure it did. The city was buzzing with anticipation. The mayor had finally agreed to move forward with the changes, and the pressure was mounting. Tiffany could feel it in the air, the weight of the decisions that were about to be made. It had been a long journey, but now, the stakes were higher than ever. Tiffany sat at her desk, reviewing the latest reports, her eyes scanning the pages with a focused intensity. Her legal team had been working tirelessly, gathering data, analyzing the patterns, and preparing for the next steps. Tiffany knew the work wasn't over. The road to reform was long. And every victory came with its own set of challenges. The phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Mark. Tiffany, we're getting ready for the next phase, he said, his voice steady but with a sense of urgency. Tiffany felt a surge of determination. What's the plan? She asked, her tone unwavering. We need to get the community involved. We've got the findings from the review, and the mayor's office is behind us. Now, we need to take it to the streets. The people need to see that we're not backing down, Mark explained. Tiffany nodded, already picturing the next steps in her mind. I agree. Let's start organizing. We need to make sure this movement grows, that people feel heard, that they see the changes happening. Over the next few days, Tiffany and Mark worked tirelessly to organize rallies, town hall meetings, and community discussions. The goal was to create a platform for the people who had been most affected by the police misconduct, to give them a space to speak and be heard. Tiffany knew that if the city was going to change, it had to come from the people. It couldn't just be another political promise. It had to be real, lasting change. As the first rally approached, Tiffany stood in front of a crowd that had gathered in the heart of the city. The streets were lined with people of all ages, all backgrounds, and all walks of life. The energy in the air was electric. People were ready for change. Tiffany took the stage, her heart pounding in her chest, but her voice steady and strong. Today, we stand together, she began, her eyes scanning the crowd, locking onto faces filled with hope and determination. Today, we take the first step toward rebuilding a system that has failed so many. This isn't just about one case. This is about creating a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. This is about a future where justice is not a luxury, but a right for all. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in unison. Tiffany felt the weight of the moment, but it was the kind of weight that fueled her. This was her purpose, her reason for fighting. And the people around her, those who had been silenced, those who had been hurt, were finally speaking up. Tiffany continued, her voice strong and clear. We've heard the promises, but now it's time to see the action. The police department will be held accountable, and the reforms we need are not just words on paper. They are actions that will change the way this city operates, from the ground up. The crowd cheered again, their voices ringing out in a powerful chorus. Tiffany could feel the momentum building, the energy in the air like a force of nature. The fight for justice was no longer something in the distance. It was happening now. In that moment, Tiffany knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she was ready. The mayor had committed to the reforms, the community was rallying behind her, and the pressure on the system was mounting. Tiffany wasn't going to stop until the change she had fought for became a reality. As the rally continued, Tiffany spoke to more people, activists, community leaders, everyday citizens who had come to lend their voices to the cause. She could see the hope in their eyes, the belief that things could be different, that the world could be better. But Tiffany also knew that this was just one step in a much longer journey. She wasn't naive enough to believe that the battle was won. The real work would come after the cameras faded, after the headlines were no longer a daily occurrence. But Tiffany was ready for that. She had always known that the fight for justice was long and hard, but it was worth every moment. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the city, Tiffany stood at the front of the rally, her heart swelling with pride. The people were speaking, and they were not going to be silenced. The battle for justice had only just begun, but Tiffany was not afraid. She had come this far, and she was determined to see it through to the end. Change was coming. And Tiffany was going to be the one to lead it. As the days passed after the rally, Tiffany could feel the pressure mounting. The city was on edge, and with the momentum she had gathered, it seemed as though everyone was waiting for the next move. The media, the citizens, and even the political figures who had been hesitant to act were now looking for the next step in the long-awaited process of reform. Tiffany had set a new standard. She wasn't just a voice anymore, she was a leader in a movement that was rapidly gaining steam. Tiffany knew this wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead was still fraught with challenges, and though the public support was overwhelming, she understood that the true battle would be behind closed doors. The real work lay in the meetings that were being arranged, the decisions that were being made without the spotlight. But Tiffany wasn't intimidated. She had already weathered the worst. She had been through the storm and had emerged stronger than ever. One evening, Tiffany sat at her desk, poring over more documents, as the phone on her desk buzzed. It was a message from Mark. "We need to talk. It's about the next phase of the reforms. The mayor's office is setting up a final meeting, and they want you there." Tiffany's mind raced as she read the message. The mayor had been true to his word so far, but Tiffany knew that the most critical decisions were still ahead. She quickly typed back, "I'll be there. Set it up." The following week, Tiffany found herself walking into the mayor's office once again. This time, the atmosphere felt different. The city had been through a lot in the past few weeks, and the momentum for change was undeniable. But Tiffany could tell that the stakes had just been raised. The mayor was already sitting at his desk when she arrived, along with several other key officials. The tension in the room was palpable. As Tiffany took her seat, the mayor looked up, his face set in a hard, unreadable expression. "Tiffany," he began, "thank you for coming. We need to discuss the next steps in the reform process. There's been a lot of pressure from both sides, and we need to find a way forward that will satisfy the people and make sure these changes are long-lasting." Tiffany nodded, her posture straight. "I'm glad to be here. But I need to make one thing clear, I'm not looking for something that just looks good on paper. The people of this city want real change. We've seen the reviews. We've heard the promises. Now it's time for action." The mayor shifted in his chair, clearly feeling the weight of her words. "We've been working on this, Tiffany," he said, his voice lower than before. "We're planning a new system of accountability, and we're setting up an independent body to oversee the police department. But this kind of change takes time. We have to be careful with how we implement it. We don't want to cause a backlash that could undo everything we've worked for." Tiffany's eyes narrowed. Time is something we've already lost. The people are tired of waiting. This system is broken, and it needs to be fixed now, not in 6 months, not next year. Now. The room fell silent. Tiffany could see the unease on the faces of the other officials. They knew she was right. The city was in a state of flux, and the longer the reforms were delayed, the more people would lose faith in the process. The mayor sighed, rubbing his temples before looking up again. "What do you want from us, Tiffany?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. Tiffany leaned forward, her voice unwavering. I want transparency. I want this to be a public process, not one that happens behind closed doors. We need a timeline, and we need clear goals. We also need a system where every officer, regardless of their rank, is held accountable for their actions. No exceptions. There was a long pause. Tiffany's words hung in the air, waiting for a response. She could feel the tension in the room, but she wasn't backing down. This was the moment that could change everything. Finally, the mayor nodded slowly. All right, he said, his voice steady but laced with the pressure of what lay ahead. We'll do it your way. We'll establish a timeline, and we'll start the process of bringing in independent oversight. But you have to understand, Tiffany, this is just the beginning. There will be resistance. There will be people who don't want this to succeed. Tiffany's gaze didn't falter. I'm prepared for that, she said. But this time, we won't be silenced. This time, we're going to make sure the changes stick. The mayor looked at her for a moment, as if weighing her resolve. I believe you, he said finally. And I think the people of this city do. Too. Tiffany stood up, her heart pounding with the weight of what had just been set in motion. The mayor had finally agreed to take the next step. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And progress was all Tiffany needed. As she left the mayor's office, Tiffany felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The work wasn't done. It would never be done until the system was completely transformed. But she had taken another step toward that goal. The people were still with her, and Tiffany knew that, together, they could change the future of the city. The real work had just begun, and Tiffany was ready for the challenge. The days that followed the mayor's agreement were filled with a flurry of meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions. Tiffany knew that the hard work was just beginning. The Independent Oversight Committee was being established, and the new training programs were being developed. It wasn't just about holding one officer accountable, it was about creating a new standard, one that would shift the culture of an entire department. Tiffany sat at her desk, reviewing the latest reports and preparing for a new round of meetings with community leaders. The work had to be thorough, there was no room for mistakes. She had already fought so hard for this moment, and she wasn't about to let it slip through her fingers. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Mark. Tiffany, the first round of town hall meetings is scheduled. The community is eager to get involved. It's time to bring them into the fold and show them that this process is for them. Tiffany smiled to herself, knowing that the people had always been at the heart of her fight. I'm ready, she typed back. Let's do this. The next week, Tiffany stood before a room full of residents from various neighborhoods across the city. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The town hall meetings had become an essential part of the reform process. It wasn't just about top-down policy changes, this was about hearing the voices of those who had been affected the most. As Tiffany took the stage, she could see the faces of people who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. They were tired of being ignored, tired of feeling invisible. Thank you all for being here today, Tiffany began, her voice steady, filled with purpose. This is your city, and these changes are for you. We are not just here to talk about what's broken, we're here to fix it, together. The room erupted in applause. Tiffany could feel the energy shift. She wasn't just speaking to a room full of people, she was speaking to a movement, one that was determined to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. As the meeting continued, Tiffany listened intently to the concerns and ideas raised by the community. Some spoke about police misconduct, others about the lack of opportunities for their children, but all were united by one common goal: change. Tiffany knew that this wasn't just about the police department. It was about creating a safer, more just society for everyone. The discussions were heated at times, but Tiffany didn't shy away. She welcomed the raw emotions, the frustration, and the calls for accountability. We will hold those in power accountable, Tiffany assured them. But we also need to rebuild trust. This process can't just be about punishing the bad, it has to be about creating a system where everyone, regardless of their background, feels protected and valued. As the meeting ended, Tiffany felt a surge of hope. The community was with her. They were not just passive participants in this process, they were driving it forward. Tiffany knew that there would be more meetings, more challenges, and more hurdles to overcome. But she also knew that they were no longer fighting alone. The momentum was undeniable. The following weeks were a blur of activity. Tiffany's team worked with city officials to finalize the plans for oversight and police reform. There were talks of reallocating funds, introducing new policies, and ensuring that the people who had been hurt by the system were the ones leading the way. Tiffany didn't hesitate to push for the changes that were needed. She was in constant communication with the mayor's office, the community leaders, and her legal team. Everyone was on the same page. This was the moment to make real, lasting change. 1. Evening, Tiffany sat in her office, reviewing the final draft of the police reform proposal. It was a long document, filled with technicalities and legal jargon, but Tiffany could see the progress they had made. It was a far cry from the broken system they had started with. The proposals included independent oversight, new training programs, a clear system of accountability, and community engagement initiatives. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Tiffany's phone buzzed again. It was Mark. "The vote is tomorrow," he wrote. "This is it. We're almost there." Tiffany leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. This was the moment she had been working for, the moment when all the pressure, all the struggles, would culminate in a vote that could change the future of the city. The next day, Tiffany stood outside the city hall, watching as community members, activists, and supporters gathered for the final vote. The atmosphere was tense, but there was an undercurrent of hope. This was their moment to make history. As the vote was called, Tiffany felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had done everything she could. Now, it was in the hands of the people. The votes were counted, and Tiffany could feel the weight of the room shift. The result was clear. The reforms had passed. The city was about to change. Tiffany stood there, surrounded by those who had fought beside her every step of the way, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to smile. The work wasn't done, but this was a monumental victory. It was proof that change was possible. And Tiffany knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice, for equality, for fairness, would continue. But now, they had a victory to build on, a foundation for the future. Tiffany had been the spark, but the fire was now in the hands of the people. And together, they would make sure it burned bright for years to come. The day after the vote, Tiffany stood in front of the city hall, looking out at the crowd gathered outside. The air was filled with excitement, anticipation, and a palpable sense of achievement. The reforms had passed. A new era had begun. But even as the cheers erupted around her, Tiffany knew that the real work was only just beginning. The city had made a commitment to change, but Tiffany understood that lasting transformation required continuous effort. She had become the face of this movement, but the journey wasn't hers alone. It belonged to every person who had been part of this fight, to every community that had raised their voice, and to every person who believed that justice wasn't just a word, but a right. Tiffany turned to Mark, who had been by her side every step of the way. His face was a mix of relief and determination. "We did it," he said, his voice steady but with an undeniable sense of pride. Tiffany nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "We've done something important, Mark. But we can't stop here. This is just the beginning. Now we need to ensure that these changes take root." Mark looked at her, understanding exactly what she meant. The reforms were just the first step in a long process. They had to be implemented properly, and that meant holding those in power accountable and making sure that the system remained transparent. Tiffany was already thinking about the next steps, the next phase of their movement. They had won a battle, but the war for justice was ongoing. Tiffany didn't want the momentum to fade. She didn't want the changes to be forgotten once the media's focus shifted elsewhere. It was time to turn the victory into something tangible, something that would last for future generations. "We're going to need to keep the pressure on," Tiffany said, her voice resolute. "We can't just let them think that this is a one-time deal. We need to be there, monitoring every step of the process, making sure that these reforms are truly put into practice. Mark agreed. I think the next step is to make sure the community stays involved. They need to see the changes in real time. We need to keep those doors open, keep the dialogue flowing. Tiffany nodded. She had always believed in the power of the people. She wasn't just leading a movement, she was part of it. And as long as the people kept their voices loud, the change would keep moving forward. The days that followed were filled with organizing and planning. Tiffany worked closely with activists, community leaders, and her legal team to ensure that the reforms were being implemented. There were meetings with the police department, with city officials, and with the communities who had been most affected by the changes. Tiffany knew that transparency was key. The people had to see the progress being made. It wasn't just about the policies on paper, it was about the real, lived experiences of those who had been overlooked for too long. As she stood at the front of another town hall meeting, Tiffany saw familiar faces in the crowd, people who had been with her from the very beginning. They had helped turn this vision into a reality, and now they were here to ensure that it continued. Tiffany addressed the crowd, her voice strong, filled with the same conviction that had carried her through the toughest moments of this journey. We've made history, but this is only the start, she said. The real work is in the implementation, in making sure that these changes don't just stay on paper. We need to be vigilant, we need to keep our voices heard, and we need to stay engaged in the process. This is our city, and we've earned the right to shape it into what it should be, just, fair, and accountable. The crowd responded with a roar of approval, their energy infectious. Tiffany could feel the strength of the movement all around her. This wasn't just her fight anymore, it was everyone's. Tiffany had known that this journey wouldn't be easy, but she had also known that it would be worth it. The city had taken a stand. Now it was time to make sure they followed through. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but Tiffany was ready. She had always believed that change was possible, that the system could be reformed if only people were willing to fight for it. Now, the people had fought, and they had won. The battle for justice was far from over, but Tiffany knew that the power of the people, the power of their voices, would continue to drive it forward. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would stand at the forefront, ensuring that the promises made were promises kept. The city had taken its first steps toward redemption. The rest of the journey was up to them. Tiffany wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever.